homeless woman found a lost puppy, and months later, it led her to fame. Living on the streets of Chicago, Maria had nothing to offer but compassion when she discovered a trembling ball of fur in a rain-soaked alley. What began as a simple act of kindness would catapult them from invisibility to international spotlight. But the journey that followed wasn't just about viral videos and fleeting attention. It would challenge everything society thought they knew about those they walked past every day. Maria's existence had shrunk to a routine of survival. Huddled beneath a highway overpass, she had become invisible. Just another shadow that commuters hurried past without a second glance. 3 years on the streets had hardened her exterior, but hollowed her from within. Each day blurred into the next as she clutched her few possessions in a weathered backpack. But winter in Chicago showed no mercy to those without shelter. Temperatures plummeted to bone-chilling lows, and the biting wind cut through Maria's layers of salvaged clothing. The local shelter was overcrowded, turning away dozens each night. "I've never felt so worthless," she later recalled. "Like I didn't deserve to exist in the same world as everyone else." On the coldest night of the year, as freezing rain turned to sleet, Maria huddled in an alley behind a restaurant, hoping for scraps. Instead, she heard it, a faint whimpering coming from behind a stack of soggy cardboard boxes. Pushing them aside, she found a small puppy, no more than a few weeks old, abandoned and shivering violently, its ribs visible through matted fur. "I remember thinking, who would throw away something so precious?" Maria said. "And then it hit me. People looked at me the same way." But what Maria didn't realize was that this tiny, shivering creature would completely transform her life in ways she never imagined. "I can barely feed myself," Maria whispered as the puppy's eyes met hers. Yet something stirred within her, a forgotten instinct to protect. She tucked the trembling bundle inside her coat, feeling its rapid heartbeat against her own. The warmth between them seemed to defy the bitter cold of the Chicago winter, creating a small pocket of hope in Maria's otherwise bleak existence. The next morning brought impossible choices. The $5 she'd saved for a hot meal now had to stretch for 2. At the convenience store, she hesitated between a sandwich for herself or dog food. The puppy won. "I named him Lucky," Maria explained, "because despite everything, he found me. And maybe, in some strange way, I was lucky too, to have something to care about again." Their days fell into a new rhythm. Maria fashioned a carrier from her spare clothes so Lucky could stay warm against her chest as she moved through the city. She learned to recognize which dumpsters might hold discarded meat scraps and which restaurant workers might slip her extra food if Lucky performed his signature head tilt. One kind-hearted barista at a local coffee shop began saving milk for the puppy, pouring it into a paper cup whenever Maria passed by before the morning rush. "I started avoiding the spots where other homeless folks gathered," Maria admitted. "Some would have sold him for drug money, others would have eaten him." The protective instinct drove her to find safer sleeping spots, beneath store awnings with security cameras or near 24-hour businesses. She became strategic, mapping mental routes through the city that offered the most protection with the least exposure to danger. The responsibility transformed her daily routine. Before Lucky, Maria might have spent hours in the public library just to stay warm, or lingered in bus stations until security moved her along. Now, she was constantly thinking about her companion's needs. Exercise, bathroom breaks, shelter from rain and snow. She found herself talking to Lucky throughout the day, her voice rusty from disuse, explaining their plans or simply narrating what she saw. After years of being treated as invisible, having someone who responded to her voice was profoundly healing. Winter's grip tightened. One night, when temperatures dropped below zero, Maria used her body as a shield against the wind, curling around Lucky in their makeshift shelter of cardboard and plastic. By morning, her fingers were numb, but the puppy was warm. "I was terrified he wouldn't make it through the night," she later recalled. "I stayed awake counting his breaths until dawn broke. That's when I realized I loved something again." As weeks passed, the scrawny puppy grew stronger, while Maria seemed to shrink. She gave him the better portions of whatever food she acquired, sometimes going hungry herself. When Lucky developed a cough, she spent her panhandling money on antibiotics instead of new socks for her blistered feet. A sympathetic veterinary assistant at a nearby clinic offered free advice when Maria brought Lucky by, concerned about his persistent sneezing. "Just a cold," the assistant assured her, slipping her a sample pack of puppy vitamins and pretending not to notice Maria's unwashed clothes and hollow cheeks. Their bond deepened beyond mere companionship. Lucky learned to alert Maria when strangers approached their sleeping spot. He would nuzzle her awake on particularly cold mornings, preventing the dangerous deep sleep that claims many homeless lives in winter. And his unconditional affection, the excited wiggle when she returned from scavenging, the warm weight against her side at night, began healing something long broken inside her. "Before Lucky, I was just surviving," Maria reflected. "But suddenly, I had a reason to think beyond the next meal or the next night. Someone depended on me." This sense of purpose sparked something she hadn't felt in years: dignity. She began to care about her appearance again, washing her face in public restrooms and keeping her hair tied back neatly. She started making eye contact with passers-by instead of staring at the ground, sometimes even managing a smile when someone acknowledged Lucky with a kind word. The puppy grew quickly, his breed a mystery, but his loyalty unquestionable. As spring approached, his coat developed a glossy sheen despite their difficult circumstances. Maria noticed people were more likely to stop and talk when they saw her with a dog. Conversations that weren't tainted with pity or disgust. For brief moments, these interactions made her feel human again, connected to the world that had long ago discarded her. One elderly man who walked his own dog in the park began saving treats for Lucky. "Animals know good people," he told Maria one morning, watching as the two dogs played together. "Your boy there is the happiest pup I've seen in ages. That says something about you, young lady." Maria had turned away to hide sudden tears, unaccustomed to kindness directed at her rather than her dog. As Maria fought to keep Lucky alive, she had no idea that someone was about to notice their extraordinary bond. Someone whose chance encounter would catapult them from the shadows of society into an unexpected spotlight that neither was prepared for. It happened on an unusually warm April morning. Maria and Lucky had established a routine of visiting Grant Park at dawn before the joggers and tourists arrived. These precious moments allowed Lucky to run freely while Maria collected herself for another day of survival. The early light painted the skyline in soft golds and pinks, creating a backdrop that briefly transformed their harsh reality into something almost magical. Samantha Chen, a freelance photographer for the Chicago Tribune, was at the park that morning shooting sunrise photos for a feature on urban green spaces. She had almost packed up her equipment when she noticed something extraordinary through her telephoto lens. A thin woman with weathered skin running alongside a medium-sized dog with unusual markings. What captured Samantha's attention wasn't just their obvious homelessness, but the unbridled joy radiating from both of them. The woman's clothes were worn and layered, her hair tucked messily under a knit cap, but her movements were graceful, almost dance-like, as she played with her companion. "I've photographed celebrities, politicians, and models, Samantha later wrote in her viral blog post. But I'd never captured pure joy like what I saw between that woman and her dog. There was something raw and genuine that made my fingers tremble on the shutter button. I knew I was witnessing something rare, a perfect moment of connection that transcended circumstance. Without thinking, Samantha began shooting. Frame after frame filled her memory card, Maria throwing a salvaged tennis ball, Lucky leaping impossibly high to catch it, both of them collapsing in what appeared to be shared laughter. In one particularly striking image, Lucky had returned to Maria's side, looking up at her, with such obvious adoration that it seemed to challenge every preconception about what homeless people could offer or receive. When Maria noticed the photographer, she initially grabbed Lucky's makeshift leash to leave, her face instantly transforming from joyful to guarded, shoulders hunching in the defensive posture she'd developed over years of public scrutiny. But Samantha approached carefully, showing Maria the photos on her camera's display. She moved slowly, speaking in the gentle tone she used when photographing skittish wildlife, giving Maria space to retreat if she chose. She showed me these pictures, Maria recalled, and for the first time in years, I saw myself as something other than garbage. In those photos, I looked human. I remember staring at this woman, Lucky, on the screen and thinking, is that really me? There was light in my eyes I thought had gone out forever. Over gas station coffee that Samantha bought, Maria hesitantly shared fragments of their story. Her job loss after the factory closure, the medical bills that drained her savings, the eviction, and finally, finding Lucky. She spoke in halting sentences at first, years of isolation having dulled her social skills, but gradually the words came more easily. She described nights so cold she couldn't feel her extremities, days when hunger twisted her stomach into knots, and the constant grinding shame of asking strangers for help. But her voice softened, gained strength when she spoke about Lucky. How he'd given her a reason to keep fighting when giving up seemed the only sensible option. Samantha asked permission to publish the photos in her personal blog alongside a short account of their circumstances. She was careful not to pressure Maria, explaining that she could take time to decide, that she understood concerns about privacy. I figured maybe a few hundred people would see it, Samantha said. I thought at most it might help them find temporary housing or connect with some local resources. I've covered homelessness before. These stories rarely gain traction beyond a momentary pang of sympathy. Maria considered the offer overnight, sleeping in their current spot, the recessed doorway of an abandoned storefront. As Lucky curled against her for warmth, she weighed the risks of visibility against the possibility of change. By morning, something in her had shifted. "What do I have to lose?" she told Samantha when they met again. "Nobody sees me anyway." 3 days later, the post had been shared over 200,000 times. The internet dubbed them the Lady and Her Lucky Star. Comments flooded in from around the world, people moved by the visible bond between the homeless woman and her devoted dog. Local news stations picked up the story, sending reporters to find the pair. A hashtag started trending. Now, find Maria and Lucky. Social media analysts later attributed the story's explosive growth to its perfect emotional alchemy. Heartbreak and hope, resilience and redemption, all captured in images so powerful they transcended language barriers. When a morning show host tearfully read Maria's story on national television, the response overwhelmed the station's servers. Donations poured in, first hundreds, then thousands of dollars. A pet food company offered a year's supply of premium dog food. A local hotel provided a temporary room while housing options were arranged. A veterinary chain promised lifetime care for Lucky. A clothing designer sent a wardrobe of practical, high-quality clothes in Maria's size, with matching bandanas for Lucky. The hotel room alone was overwhelming for Maria. After 3 years without privacy, without walls, without a door to close, she found herself pacing the carpeted floor, unable to sleep on the too-soft mattress. The first night, she and Lucky ended up huddled in the bathtub, the enclosed space more comforting than the expansive bedroom. The minibar remained untouched. Maria couldn't bring herself to open it, certain there must be some catch, some cost she couldn't afford. When room service knocked with breakfast the second morning, she hid in the closet until they left, old survival instincts overriding rational thought. Maria, who had spent years being ignored by passers-by, suddenly couldn't walk down the street without being recognized. It was terrifying, she admitted. People wanted to touch Lucky, take selfies with us. Some cried when they met us. I didn't understand what was happening. One woman grabbed my hands and said I'd saved her marriage because my story made her husband appreciate what they had. How was I supposed to respond to that? The attention brought opportunities, but also intense pressure. A publishing house offered a book deal. 3 different documentary filmmakers requested exclusive rights to their story. A famous actor's production company floated the idea of a movie adaptation. Samantha, feeling partially responsible for the media tsunami, helped Maria navigate these offers, connecting her with a pro bono lawyer who specialized in entertainment contracts. Everyone wanted a piece of her story, Samantha recalled. But few seemed concerned about Maria herself, the actual person behind the viral moment. They wanted the perfect homeless redemption narrative, not the complicated, messy reality of someone dealing with years of trauma in survival mode. Through it all, Lucky remained Maria's anchor. When the cameras and attention became overwhelming, she would bury her face in his fur, drawing strength from his steady presence. In interviews, while Maria sometimes stumbled over words, Lucky would place his paw on her knee as if offering reassurance. His intuitive responses to her anxiety became another aspect of their story that captivated audiences. Clips of Lucky comforting a visibly nervous Maria during her first television appearance were viewed millions of times. Everyone wanted to know how I saved Lucky, Maria told a reporter. But they don't understand. He saved me first. Without him, I would have been just another statistic, another nameless person who froze to death under a bridge. He gave me something to live for when I'd forgotten why life mattered. As their story spread, it sparked conversations about homelessness, the therapeutic value of animal companionship, and society's tendency to overlook those living on the margins. Experts appeared on talk shows discussing the Maria effect, the phenomenon of people reconsidering their preconceptions about homelessness because of the emotional connection they felt to her story. Donations to animal shelters and homeless outreach programs spiked nationwide. Several cities expedited programs, allowing homeless individuals in shelters to keep their pets, initiatives that had previously stalled in committee discussions. Maria received thousands of letters, from children who emptied their piggy banks to help, from veterans who recognized the symptoms of her undiagnosed PTSD, from other homeless individuals who saw themselves reflected in her struggle. A team of volunteers helped sort through the correspondence. But Maria insisted on reading as many as she could, often staying up late in her hotel room, sounding out words she hadn't encountered since dropping out of high school, Lucky dozing beside her. I never graduated, she confessed to Samantha during a quiet moment. But I'm smart. I was smart before the streets, and I'm still smart now. People look at me and see only what happened to me, not who I am. The financial windfall from donations presented its own challenges. Having lived day to day for so long, Maria struggled with concepts like savings accounts and budgeting. A financial advisor volunteered to help manage the funds, setting up structures to ensure long-term stability while addressing immediate needs. Maria's first priority was securing appropriate housing that allowed pets, still a significant barrier in many rental markets despite her newfound resources. But fame, even the overnight variety, comes with complications. As Maria's visibility increased, so did scrutiny. Tabloids dug into her past, uncovering details about a previous struggle with addiction that she had overcome years before becoming homeless. Distant relatives emerged, some offering genuine support, others clearly interested in potential financial gain. Online forums debated whether she deserved help more than other homeless individuals, creating hierarchies of worthiness that reflected society's complicated relationship with charity and assistance. And as Maria would soon discover, having the world know your name doesn't necessarily mean they understand your journey. The narrative constructed around her, the heartwarming story of a woman and her dog against the world, was already beginning to chafe against the more complex reality of her experience. The pressure to remain grateful, inspirational, and camera-ready while processing the seismic shifts in her circumstances took a toll that few in the adoring public could comprehend. As the second week of her newfound fame came to a close, Maria sat alone on the balcony of her hotel room, watching the same Chicago skyline that had once represented a world closed to her. Lucky slept peacefully inside, finally comfortable in their temporary home. She fingered the key card in her pocket, a small plastic rectangle that represented safety, security, and a door she could close against the world. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to consider a future beyond survival. But with that tentative hope came a new fear. What happened when the cameras turned away? When her story was no longer trending? When she became, once again, just Maria? The answers to those questions would challenge her in ways that homelessness never had. 6 weeks after Samantha's photographs went viral, Maria sat in the waiting room of a downtown office building, Lucky curled at her feet. The dog, now sporting a proper leather collar, though Maria had refused to replace his original makeshift leash, keeping it as a reminder, had adapted to their new circumstances with typical canine flexibility. Maria's adjustment proved more difficult. "Ms. Ramirez, they're ready for you now?" The receptionist's voice was professionally pleasant, betraying no judgment about the woman whose story had dominated social media for over a month. Maria nodded, smoothing down the button-up shirt she still wasn't comfortable wearing. Her new wardrobe, practical quality pieces selected by a stylist who specialized in authentic, relatable looks, felt like a costume. The shoes pinched. The jeans, though perfectly fitted, seemed to restrict her movements after years of layered, salvaged clothing that allowed for quick adaptation to changing weather. Beyond the door waited her newly formed team, the literary agent negotiating her memoir deal, the financial advisor managing the trust established from donations, the publicist handling media requests, and the therapist who specialized in trauma and sudden life transitions. All arranged by the nonprofit that had stepped in to help Maria navigate her unexpected fame. "We have several options for permanent housing," the financial advisor began, sliding glossy printouts across the table. "All within your budget, all pet-friendly." Maria stared at the photos of pristine apartments with gleaming countertops and empty rooms. After years of carrying everything she owned, the concept of filling space seemed foreign, almost threatening. "And we've had another offer for a television interview," the publicist added. "They're proposing a primetime special." From homeless to household name, the Maria and Lucky's story. Maria's fingers found Lucky's ears, stroking them rhythmically. Do I have to decide now? The publicist's smile tightened slightly. Well, these opportunities have expiration dates. People move on to the next story. Quickly. We need to capitalize while interest is high. Capitalize. The word echoed in Maria's mind. 6 weeks ago, she had been invisible, surviving on society's margins. Now she was a commodity, a story to be packaged and sold, a vehicle for others' inspiration or entertainment. The publisher is also pushing for a timeline, the literary agent interjected. They want the memoir completed within 8 months to ride this wave of public interest. 8 months? Maria's voice cracked. I can barely process what happened yesterday, let alone everything from the past 3 years. The therapist, Dr. Winters, finally spoke. Perhaps we're moving too quickly. Maria is still adjusting to basic stability. Writing a memoir requires emotional resources she may not have right now. A tense silence fell over the room. Maria felt the familiar tightness in her chest. The same panic that had gripped her when strangers approached on the street, when police officers shined flashlights into her sleeping spots, when shelter staff enforced rules that separated her from Lucky. I need air, she said abruptly, standing. Lucky immediately rose beside her, attuned to her distress. Just give me a minute. In the hallway, Maria leaned against the wall, breathing deeply. Lucky pressed against her legs, a warm, solid reminder of the one constant in her chaotic new life. A maintenance worker passed by, giving her a curious glance, but continuing on his way. That small moment of anonymity felt like oxygen to a drowning woman. When she returned to the conference room, her decision was made. I'm grateful for everything, she began carefully. But I need to slow down. No television special. No 8-month book deadline. The publicist began to protest, but Maria continued, her voice finding strength. I was homeless, not helpless. I survived because I learned to trust my instincts. And right now, they're telling me this is too much, too fast. Dr. Winters nodded approvingly as Maria outlined her revised plan. A modest 2-bedroom apartment rather than the luxury options presented. A part-time job working at an animal shelter that had offered her a position. And time, unstructured, unpressured time, to decompress and determine her own narrative. The public will lose interest, the publicist warned. Maria scratched behind Lucky's ears, meeting the woman's gaze directly. Then they lose interest. My story isn't for sale. My life isn't a product to be marketed while supplies last. That evening, Maria and Lucky moved into their new apartment in a quiet neighborhood far from downtown. The space echoed with emptiness, containing only essential furniture, a bed, a couch, a small dining table with 2 chairs. Maria had requested nothing more, overwhelmed by the prospect of possessions after so long without them. They spent their first night on the living room floor, a blanket spread beneath them, the bed too soft and too large to feel safe. Lucky sprawled beside her, and steady breathing a lullaby she had come to depend on. We're going to be okay, she whispered to him, though the words were really for herself. We just need to remember who we were before the world decided who we should be. The transition proved more challenging than even Maria had anticipated. She jumped at unexpected sounds in the apartment building. She stockpiled food in cabinets, unable to trust that tomorrow's meals were secured. She struggled to sleep through the night in a space so quiet, so enclosed, after years of constant vigilance in public spaces. At the animal shelter, however, Maria found unexpected solace. The simple tasks of feeding, walking, and bathing rescued animals grounded her. The animals, like Lucky responded to her energy rather than her story. They didn't care about her viral fame or her traumatic past. They needed presence, patience, and gentle hands. All things Maria had in abundance. "You have a gift," her supervisor remarked, watching Maria coax a terrified pit bull mix from the back of its kennel. "These animals trust you." "We recognize each other," Maria replied simply. "We know what it's like to be overlooked." As weeks passed, Maria established new routines. Morning walks with Lucky, shifts at the shelter, sessions with Dr. Winters. Cooking simple meals in her own kitchen, a skill slowly returning after years of makeshift meals from convenience stores and fast food leftovers. She began writing too. Not the memoir her publishers wanted, but private reflections in a journal Dr. Winters had encouraged her to keep. Short observations about the strangeness of having keys, of showering whenever she wanted, of sleeping without one eye open. Memories of her life before homelessness, fragments she had suppressed to survive the present. And increasingly, thoughts about a future she had never allowed herself to imagine. The media attention gradually waned, as predicted. Occasionally, someone would recognize her at the grocery store or on the street, approaching with well-meaning but intrusive questions. Maria developed a polite but firm response. "Lucky and I are doing well. Thank you for your concern." 3 months after moving into the apartment, Maria received an email from Samantha Chen. The photographer had respected Maria's request for space, maintaining distance as Maria adjusted to her new life. Now she was asking permission to include their story in a photography book about human-animal bonds, with proceeds benefiting both homeless outreach programs and animal shelters. Maria sat with the request for several days, discussing it with Dr. Winters and reflecting on her journey. Finally, she invited Samantha to the apartment, the first visitor she had welcomed into her space. "It's simple," Samantha remarked, looking around the sparsely furnished rooms. "It's enough," Maria replied. Lucky, now comfortable in his role as host, brought Samantha a well-loved tennis ball, his invitation to play. As they talked, Maria realized how much had changed. Not just her circumstances, but her perspective. The viral fame had been overwhelming, intrusive, and at times exploitative. But it had also created opportunities she could never have accessed on her own. The challenge wasn't rejecting those opportunities entirely, but engaging with them on her own terms, at her own pace. "I'll participate in your book," Maria decided. "But I want to write my own captions for the photos, and I want to review everything before publication." Samantha readily agreed. "It's your story to tell, Maria. It always has been." Later that evening, after Samantha left, Maria stood at her apartment window, watching the neighborhood settle into twilight. Lucky dozed on his bed nearby, secure in the knowledge that this space was theirs, that tomorrow would unfold in predictable ways. Maria's phone buzzed with a text from her therapist, confirming their appointment for the following day. On the counter lay her work schedule for the animal shelter, her name printed alongside other employees. The refrigerator held food for the week ahead. Simple things that once seemed impossibly out of reach. "We're building something new," she told Lucky, who opened one eye at the sound of her voice. "Something that belongs to us, not to the story people wanted us to be." The dog thumped his tail in agreement, then drifted back to sleep, confident in their shared journey forward. Maria turned from the window, picking up her journal from the table. Tonight, for the first time, she would write about the future. Not just tomorrow or next week, but years ahead. A future where her past informed but did not define her. A future built on her own terms, one day at a time. Outside, the city continued its relentless pace. But within these walls, Maria and Lucky had found something beyond viral fame or public fascination. They had found home. 1 year after the viral photographs changed her life, Maria stood in front of a small audience at the community center where she now worked part-time. Lucky, wearing his therapy dog vest, sat attentively beside her. The room was filled with social workers, volunteers, and individuals currently experiencing homelessness, a far cry from the television studios that had once clamored for her presence. "Recovery isn't linear," Maria began, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "That's something I've learned this year. There are good days when everything feels possible, and there are days when I still find myself hoarding food wrappers or startling at normal sounds in my building. Both kinds of days are part of my journey. The past 12 months had been transformative in ways Maria never could have predicted. After the media spotlight faded, she had faced the real work of rebuilding. Not just her external circumstances, but her internal landscape, shaped by years of survival mode and the hypervigilance that homelessness had ingrained. With Dr. Winter's guidance, Maria had gradually addressed the complex trauma of her years on the street. She learned that her brain had physically rewired itself for constant threat detection, that her difficulty sleeping in a bed and her tendency to hide food weren't character flaws, but adaptive responses to extreme circumstances. Most importantly, she discovered that healing these patterns required patience and self-compassion rather than the forced gratitude many expected from her. "People often ask me if I'm fixed now that I have housing and resources," she continued, looking around the room, as if homelessness was the only problem, and everything else should fall into place once that's solved. But that's not how it works. Getting off the street is just the beginning. Maria had ultimately declined the lucrative book deal, unwilling to package her trauma into a neat, inspirational narrative on someone else's timeline. Instead, she had worked with a local nonprofit to develop this workshop series, Beyond Housing, the emotional journey of recovery, designed for both service providers and those they served. "The hardest part wasn't learning to pay bills again or finding employment," she explained. "It was learning to see myself as someone with a future, someone who deserved to take up space in the world. After years of being treated as invisible or unwanted, I had internalized that message. Lucky was the only one who saw me differently." At the mention of his name, Lucky's tail thumped against the floor. The dog had undergone his own transformation, completing therapy dog training 6 months earlier. Now he accompanied Maria to shelters and outreach programs, his intuitive gentleness helping others the way it had once helped her. After the workshop, Maria chatted with participants, answering questions and exchanging contact information with several outreach workers interested in bringing her program to their facilities. As the room emptied, a young woman approached hesitantly, her clothes showing the telltale signs of street life. Layered, practical, worn at the edges. "I've been following your story," she said quietly. "Not the famous part, but what you've done since. I've been out here for 8 months, and sometimes I can't remember who I was before." Maria recognized the hollow look in the woman's eyes, the way she scanned exits and kept her backpack close. "What's your name?" she asked. "Tasha. Are you open to some help, Tasha? Not just housing, but the whole journey?" The woman's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know if I can do it. Everything feels so far away, you know. Like normal life is on the other side of glass." Maria nodded. "I know exactly what that feels like. But you don't have to figure it out all at once." She reached into her bag and pulled out a business card. Not the glossy one her publicist had created during her brief fame, but a simple one with her name and the community center's information. We have a women's program starting next week. No pressure, no cameras, no inspiring story required. Just practical support and people who understand. Tasha took the card, studying it before carefully tucking it into her pocket. Maybe I'll come, if I can bring my cat. He's all I've got. Maria smiled. Pets are always welcome. They're family. After Tasha left, Maria and Lucky walked the few blocks to their apartment. The neighborhood had become familiar over the past year. The barista who knew their regular order, the elderly man who saved treats for Lucky, the librarian who recommended books based on Maria's evolving interests. Small connections that anchored her to this new life. At home, Maria kicked off her shoes and settled on the couch, which now held colorful throw pillows and a handmade Afghan. Touches of personality she had gradually added as the apartment transformed from a shelter to a home. Lucky jumped up beside her, resting his head on her lap. "Good work today," she told him, scratching his favorite spot behind his ears. "You helped Tasha feel safe. I could tell." On the coffee table lay a stack of notebooks, her journals from the past year, documenting her recovery process. Beside them sat a laptop, open to a document titled, "On My Own Terms, Reclaiming Dignity After Displacement." The memoir was taking shape slowly, written in early mornings and quiet evenings, without deadlines or external pressure. Her phone buzzed with a text from Samantha. The photography book featuring Maria and Lucky's story had been published 3 months earlier, with Maria's unfiltered captions providing context to the powerful images. It had received modest but meaningful attention, and more importantly, had helped fund programs for both homeless individuals and abandoned animals. "Book signing event next month?" Samantha's text read. "Small bookstore, intimate setting, proceeds to the community center. No pressure." A year ago, such an invitation would have triggered anxiety and resistance. Now, Maria considered it thoughtfully, weighing her emotional capacity against the potential benefit to the center's programs. "Count us in," she replied. "Lucky enjoys his fan club." As evening settled over the city, Maria prepared a simple dinner, moving comfortably through the kitchen that now felt like her own. The refrigerator door held a calendar marked with work shifts, therapy appointments, and social engagements. The structured rhythm of a life rebuilding itself day by day. Later, curled up in bed with Lucky snoring softly beside her, Maria reflected on the day's workshop and Tasha's hesitant hope. There had been so many moments in the past year when Maria herself had doubted her ability to bridge the gap between survival and living. When the expectations of others had threatened to overwhelm her authentic recovery process. But she had found her way through, not by following the redemption narrative others wanted to impose, but by honoring the complex, non-linear reality of healing. By recognizing that her worth existed independently of her story's inspirational value to others. By allowing herself to need help without becoming defined by that need. "We're exactly where we're supposed to be," she whispered to Lucky, who shifted closer in his sleep. Outside her window, Chicago continued its nighttime rhythm. The distant sounds of traffic, occasional voices, the urban symphony that had once been the backdrop to her struggle for survival. Now it was simply the soundtrack to her life. A life that included struggle and joy, setbacks and progress, past trauma and future possibilities. Maria closed her eyes, no longer needing to remain vigilant against the dangers of the night. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The ongoing work of recovery, the responsibility of helping others like Tasha, the balance between privacy and purposeful visibility. But tonight, in this moment, she was at peace with her journey. Not because it followed a perfect narrative arc, but because it was authentically, imperfectly her own. And that was enough. 18 months after Maria and Lucky's story first captured public attention, they stood together on a small stage at City Hall. The audience was modest: city officials, social service providers, community advocates, and a handful of journalists. But the occasion was significant. Mayor Reeves was signing into law the Companions Matter Ordinance, ensuring that all city-funded homeless shelters and transitional housing programs would accommodate pets. This legislation wouldn't exist without Maria Ramirez and her dog Lucky, the mayor announced, gesturing toward them. Their story highlighted what many service providers already knew: that for people experiencing homelessness, pets aren't luxury items. They're family, emotional support, and often the only constant in a life filled with uncertainty. Maria shifted uncomfortably under the attention. Though she had grown more accustomed to public speaking, she still preferred working behind the scenes. But this cause had been worth stepping into the spotlight once more. She had spent months testifying at city council meetings, gathering signatures, and helping draft the policy language alongside housing advocates and animal welfare experts. The journey to this moment had been arduous. Maria recalled the first community forum where she'd spoken about pet-inclusive shelters, her voice trembling as she described nights spent in freezing temperatures because the alternative meant surrendering Lucky. She remembered the skeptical questions from budget analysts concerned about implementation costs, the resistance from traditional shelter operators worried about liability, and the dismissive comments from those who believed resources for the homeless should be strictly utilitarian. But she had persevered, learning to translate her personal experience into compelling testimony, to cite research studies on the therapeutic benefits of animal companionship, and to build coalitions between seemingly disparate groups, animal welfare organizations and homeless advocacy networks that had rarely collaborated before. She had even accompanied architects and shelter directors on site visits to facilities in other cities that had successfully implemented pet-friendly policies, taking notes and asking practical questions that only someone with lived experience would think to raise. "Would you like to say a few words?" the mayor asked, offering the microphone. Taking a deep breath, Maria approached the podium, Lucky maintaining perfect therapy dog composure beside her despite the cameras and crowd. 3 years ago, I was faced with an impossible choice, she began, her voice steady. Enter a shelter system that would separate me from Lucky, or remain on the streets together. I chose the streets because Lucky wasn't just a pet. He was the only being who saw me as a person when the rest of the world looked through me. She paused, gathering her thoughts. This ordinance isn't about special treatment. It's about removing unnecessary barriers to safety and stability. It's about recognizing that healing happens faster when we don't force people to abandon their most trusted companions. And it's about acknowledging that compassion shouldn't come with conditions. As she spoke, Maria scanned the audience, noting the presence of several individuals she had met through her outreach work, people still experiencing homelessness who had brought their own animal companions to witness this moment. She saw Daryl with his aging beagle, Mona with her calico cat peering from a carrier, and veteran Joe with his service dog in training. They had all contributed to this effort, sharing their stories in community forums and council meetings, often at great personal cost given their vulnerability and limited resources. I want to acknowledge that I'm just one voice among many, Maria continued, departing from her prepared remarks. There are countless individuals who couldn't be here today. People who are making the same choice I did, to remain unsheltered rather than abandon their animal companions. This ordinance honors their devotion and removes an unnecessary barrier to their safety and recovery. She turned slightly to address the row of shelter directors and program managers. Implementation won't always be easy. There will be challenges and adjustments. But I've seen firsthand how organizations willing to accommodate pets create environments where healing and progress happen more quickly. Where trust builds because people aren't forced to sacrifice their most important relationships to receive help. Looking back at the broader audience, Maria concluded, "This ordinance isn't the end of our work, it's a beginning. A recognition that policies work best when they account for the full humanity of those they aim to serve." Thank you to everyone who listened, who adjusted their thinking, and who recognized that sometimes the smallest changes make the biggest difference in people's lives. The applause was genuine, if not thunderous. This wasn't a glamorous policy achievement that would make national headlines. But for those affected, it represented a profound shift in approach, one that acknowledged the complexity of homelessness beyond mere housing status. After the ceremony, as Maria fielded questions from reporters, a city council member approached with a business card. "The Housing Committee is forming a lived experience advisory board," she explained. "We need voices like yours, thoughtful, nuanced, grounded in reality. It's a paid position, quarterly meetings. Would you consider applying?" Maria accepted the card, tucking it into her pocket alongside the business cards she now carried for her multiple roles. Community outreach coordinator at the shelter where she had once volunteered, peer support specialist for a women's recovery program, and consultant for a trauma-informed care initiative. "I'll think about it," she promised, though her schedule was already full. The demand for her perspective had grown as organizations recognized the value of including those with lived experience in program development and policy decisions. As the crowd dispersed, Maria noticed a familiar figure hovering near the back of the room, her younger brother Miguel, whom she hadn't seen in over 4 years. Their relationship had been complicated by her descent into homelessness, strained by his inability to help and her pride that prevented asking. When her story went viral, he had reached out via email, but Maria had been overwhelmed by the attention and unsure how to reconnect without the weight of their shared history crushing any possibility of reconciliation. Now he approached cautiously, hands in his pockets, uncertainty written across features that had matured since she'd last seen him. "That was really something," he said, nodding toward the podium where she had spoken. "You always were the stubborn one in the family." Maria felt Lucky press against her leg, sensing her emotional turmoil. "Stubborn enough to survive," she replied, the words coming out more defensively than intended. Miguel winced slightly. "I deserve that. I should have tried harder to find you, to help. And I should have swallowed my pride and called when things got bad," Maria admitted, the anger she had carried dissolving into something more complicated. Grief for lost time, recognition of mutual pain, tentative hope for repair. "I'm proud of you, sis," Miguel said softly. "Not because you're some success story now, but because you're still you, fighting for what matters, making noise when something's wrong. That hasn't changed." Maria felt tears threatening and blinked them back. This wasn't the place for a family reunion, but perhaps it was the beginning of one. "Are you free for coffee sometime this week?" she asked. Miguel's smile revealed both relief and caution. "Absolutely. Just tell me when." Later that evening, Maria hosted a small gathering in her apartment to celebrate the ordinance's passage. The space had evolved over time, now filled with carefully chosen furnishings, photographs, and mementos that reflected her emerging sense of self beyond survival. A bookshelf held volumes on trauma recovery, animal behavior, and social policy, alongside novels and poetry collections. Evidence of her rekindled love of reading. The apartment was modest by conventional standards, a one-bedroom unit in a mixed-income development with basic amenities. Maria had deliberately chosen to live below her means, investing the remaining funds from donations and her current income into a savings account that provided security without luxury. The memories of financial precarity were still too fresh, the fear of returning to homelessness too visceral to justify spending on anything beyond thoughtful comfort. What made the space remarkable wasn't its size or furnishings, but the sense of intentional creation it conveyed. Each item had been chosen with care. From the sturdy, comfortable dog bed positioned near the window, where Lucky could observe the neighborhood activities, to the collection of plants thriving on the small balcony, to the wall calendar where Maria meticulously tracked appointments, work schedules, and self-care activities. It was a home built with awareness of both fragility and resilience. Samantha arrived with a framed print, the first photograph she had taken of Maria and Lucky playing in the park at dawn, the image that had started everything. "For your wall of accomplishments," she said, nodding toward the corner where Maria displayed her therapy dog certification with Lucky, her peer support specialist credential, and other markers of their journey. "I almost didn't approach you that morning," Samantha admitted as they found a place for the photograph. "I worried about intruding, about exploiting your situation. Sometimes I still wonder if I made the right choice." Maria considered this as she adjusted the frame. "I've thought about that a lot too, whether the attention helped or hurt in the long run." She stepped back to assess the placement. "I think the answer is both. The exposure was overwhelming, sometimes dehumanizing. But it also created opportunities I never would have had otherwise." She turned to face her friend. "The difference was having people like you who respected my boundaries afterward, who didn't treat me like a character in some inspirational movie, who let me be complicated and inconsistent and human." Dr. Winters brought a homemade casserole and news of a research grant she had received to study the therapeutic benefits of animal companionship for those recovering from homelessness. "Your story helped secure the funding," she told Maria. "The review committee was particularly impressed by the longitudinal data we've gathered on your recovery process." "Longitudinal data?" Maria repeated with a wry smile. "You mean my life?" The therapist laughed. "Academia has a way of making the personal sound clinical. But yes, essentially. Your willingness to document your experience, the setbacks as well as the progress, provides valuable insights that generic outcome measurements miss." Maria had come to appreciate Dr. Winters' blend of professional expertise and personal warmth. Unlike the parade of social workers who had briefly entered and exited her life during her homeless years, Dr. Winters had maintained a consistent presence, adjusting their work together as Maria's needs evolved from crisis management to deeper healing to integration of her experiences. "Will you include the nightmares in your research?" Maria asked quietly. "The times I still sleep on the floor because the bed feels too exposed? The food hoarding? The panic attacks in crowded stores?" Dr. Winters nodded solemnly. "With your permission, yes. Because recovery isn't a before and after story. It's ongoing adaptation. And service providers need to understand that housing alone doesn't heal trauma. It just creates the conditions where healing becomes possible." As the evening progressed, Maria found herself in conversation with Tasha, who had indeed shown up at the community center with her cat the previous year. Now in transitional housing and working part-time at a veterinary clinic, Tasha was slowly building her own path to stability. Sometimes I still can't believe this is my life, Tasha confessed, watching her cat play with a toy in the corner of Maria's living room. I wake up expecting to be back under the viaduct. Maria nodded in understanding. The hypervigilance fades, but it never completely disappears, at least not for me. Last week the power went out for an hour, and I immediately packed an emergency bag without even thinking about it. Does it bother you? Those leftover instincts? Mariah considered the question thoughtfully. Not anymore. They're part of me, not the whole story, but an important chapter. They remind me of my resilience. Tasha absently stroked her cat, who had returned to her lap. The clinic manager asked if I'd be interested in training for the veterinary assistant program. Said they'd work around my classes if I wanted to go back to school. She spoke the words cautiously, as if saying them too confidently might jinx the possibility. That sounds perfect for you, Maria encouraged. You have a natural way with animals. I don't know if I can do it, Tasha admitted. Being around normal people all day, pretending I haven't lived under bridges and eaten from dumpsters. Sometimes I feel like I'm faking everything, like I don't belong in regular society. Maria recognized the sentiment all too well. The imposter syndrome that accompanied reintegration, the fear that others could somehow sense the mark of homelessness, the exhaustion of code switching between worlds. You don't have to pretend, she said gently. Your experiences are part of what will make you good at this work. You understand suffering and resilience in ways others don't. That's not a liability, it's an asset. She hesitated, then added, but I also understand the fear. I still feel it sometimes, like I'm balancing on a tightrope between worlds. Like one wrong move, and I'll fall back into the abyss. Tasha's eyes filled with tears. Exactly. And nobody gets it unless they've been there. Which is why we need people like you in all kinds of roles, Maria said. Not just in homeless services, but everywhere. Healthcare, education, business, government. People who can bridge the gap, who can translate between experiences. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Jordan, Maria's neighbor from across the hall, who had become a friend over the past year. A graduate student in urban planning, Jordan had initially sought Maria's input on a class project about mixed-income housing developments. Their relationship had evolved into a genuine friendship based on shared interests in community development and social justice, though their life experiences differed dramatically. Sorry I'm late, Jordan apologized, setting down a tray of homemade empanadas. The department meeting ran long, and then I had to finish these. You didn't have to bring anything, Maria protested, though she was touched by the gesture. Are you kidding? After all the times you fed me when I was drowning in thesis work? Jordan grinned. Besides, these are my grandmother's recipe. She made me promise to share them with good people. The gathering continued, conversations flowing between serious policy discussions and light-hearted stories. Maria moved between groups, ensuring everyone felt welcomed, occasionally catching Lucky's eye across the room where he was charming guests with his gentle demeanor. This, too, was part of her recovery. Learning to host, to welcome others into her space, to create community on her own terms. Each social interaction represented a small victory over the isolation that homelessness had forced upon her, a reclaiming of her capacity for connection. After her guests departed, Maria sat at her desk, opening her laptop to continue work on her memoir. Unlike the sensationalized version publishers had initially wanted, this book was taking shape as a nuanced exploration of homelessness, recovery, and the systems that both perpetuate and address housing insecurity. She had secured a modest deal with a university press, valuing editorial integrity over commercial potential. The writing process had been therapeutic but challenging, forcing Maria to revisit painful memories and confront the complex interplay of personal choices and systemic failures that had contributed to her homelessness. Some chapters had flowed easily. Others required multiple sessions with Dr. Winters to process the emotions they excavated. Tonight, she was working on a section about the invisible labor of homelessness, the exhausting daily work of finding safe places to sleep, securing food and water, maintaining minimal hygiene, protecting belongings, and navigating bureaucratic systems designed more for processing than for helping. She wanted readers to understand that homelessness was not a passive state of being, but an active, demanding existence that required constant problem-solving and decision-making under extreme duress. Lucky settled at her feet as her fingers moved across the keyboard, adding to the chapter about the day's ordinance passage. Writing had become a form of processing for Maria, a way to integrate her experiences and transform them into something that might help others navigate similar journeys. A notification appeared on her screen, an email from a graduate student requesting an interview for a dissertation on post-traumatic growth and advocacy among formerly homeless individuals. Maria flagged it for later consideration, aware of her need to balance sharing her story with protecting her energy. This was the unexpected legacy of her viral moment, a platform she could use purposefully, selectively, to challenge misconceptions and influence change, not through inspirational platitudes or oversimplified success narratives, but through honest communication about the complex realities of homelessness and recovery. She had learned to be discerning about these requests, to assess whether they approached homelessness with nuance or sought merely to extract inspirational sound bites. She had developed a list of questions for potential interviewers. How will this information be used? What assumptions are you bringing to this research? How will you ensure ethical representation of vulnerable populations? Will participants have an opportunity to review how their stories are presented? These boundaries had evolved through trial and error. Early in her recovery, eager to help and still uncomfortable with asserting her needs, Maria had agreed to numerous speaking engagements and interviews that left her emotionally depleted. She had watched her complex narrative be simplified into before and after segments that erased the ongoing challenges of her journey. She had sat through presentations where her story was used to imply that individual determination was the primary factor in overcoming homelessness, obscuring the critical role of structural support and community resources. Now she chose her engagements carefully, prioritizing those that allowed for genuine education and systemic change. She had become particularly invested in training healthcare providers, law enforcement officers, and social service workers in trauma-informed approaches to working with homeless individuals. These sessions often included Lucky, whose presence helped demonstrate the therapeutic value of animal companionship, while also making difficult conversations more accessible. Her phone chimed with a text from Samantha. "Check your email. Just sent you something interesting." Maria opened the message to find a link to a news article about a pilot program in Seattle modeled after the ordinance Chicago had just passed. The article quoted Maria's testimony to the city council and referenced the research Dr. Winters was conducting. "It's spreading," Samantha had written. "Your ripples are becoming waves." Maria smiled, feeling a complex mix of emotions, pride in the tangible impact, humility about her role in a much larger movement, and quiet satisfaction that her most painful experiences were being transformed into something constructive. She clicked through to read the full article, noting with approval that it included perspectives from both service providers and people currently experiencing homelessness with pets. The program description addressed practical considerations Maria had emphasized in her advocacy. secure storage for pet supplies, partnerships with local veterinarians for basic care, training for staff on animal behavior and stress signals, and clear protocols for addressing concerns like allergies or phobias among other shelter residents. The article mentioned that initial data showed increased rates of program engagement and retention among pet owners in the Seattle pilot, supporting Maria's argument that accommodating animals created pathways to more effective service delivery rather than complications. Outside, rain began to fall, pattering against the windows of the apartment. Lucky raised his head at the sound, then relaxed when Maria scratched behind his ears reassuringly. "We're safe," she told him, a reminder for them both. The phrase had become a ritual between them, words Maria had whispered countless times during thunderstorms under bridges, during police sweeps of encampments, during nights when strange noises or approaching footsteps signaled potential danger. Now, in the security of their apartment, the words served as a bridge between past and present, an acknowledgement of how far they had come while honoring the bond forged in hardship. On her desk calendar, she noted upcoming commitments, a presentation at the State Housing Conference, a meeting with shelter architects designing pet-friendly spaces, her regular shifts at the community center, and a weekend volunteer session at the animal shelter where she had first found meaningful work after getting housed. She also marked a new entry: coffee with Miguel on Thursday, a tentative step toward rebuilding family connections that had frayed during her years of homelessness. Their parents had passed away before her housing crisis, but she had cousins, nieces, and nephews she hadn't seen in years. Reconnection brought its own challenges. Explaining absences, navigating changed relationships, managing the shame that still occasionally surfaced despite her therapeutic work. Her life had found a rhythm, a purpose that extended beyond daily survival. The viral fame had faded, as all such phenomena do. But it had created openings that Maria had thoughtfully stepped through, choosing pathways aligned with her values rather than others' expectations. As she returned to her writing, Maria reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From invisible to overexposed, and back to a life of her own choosing. From survival mode to recovery to advocacy. From a woman defined by her lack of housing to a multifaceted individual whose experiences informed but did not limit her identity. She typed a new paragraph for her memoir. Recovery isn't about erasing the past or pretending the scars don't exist. It's about integration, weaving the painful threads of experience into the broader tapestry of a life that includes joy, purpose, connection, and possibility. It's about reclaiming agency in a world that often reduces those who have experienced homelessness to passive recipients of either charity or contempt. Most importantly, it's about recognizing that healing happens in community, that the path from survival to thriving requires both internal resilience and external support. None of us recover alone. Lucky sighed contentedly in his sleep, his presence a constant reminder of the bond that had sustained her through it all. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to navigate the complex terrain of visibility and privacy, influence and boundaries, past trauma and future possibilities. But tonight, in this space they had made their own, Maria embraced the fullness of her story, not as a neat before and after narrative, but as an ongoing evolution, a life reclaimed, rebuilt, and redirected toward a purpose that honored both where she had been and where she was going. The rain continued its gentle rhythm as her fingers returned to the keyboard, adding words to a story that was still unfolding, one authentic day at a time.